I'm Sarah, and when I was younger, it was always my dream to make books. So I need this, I guess. No. Ah, okay, back to books. So I grew up in a house that was full of books. So this is a stock photo, but it looks very similar actually. And my mom always used to say that I was able to read in every position that I could think of. So yeah, I had a huge opportunity to fall in love with reading and books. So I always wanted to make them as well. I didn't want to be an author because I didn't really know what I wanted to write about, but I wanted to work in publishing and help create books because I always thought it would be amazing to help make something that where you have an actual physical object that you can hold in your hands as the result of what you do. Well, it turned out that what I do now looks more like this. So it's not physical at all. Can you read that? I hope not, because it's also just a stock photo, and I think it's jQuery. And I'm a front-end developer, so what I do nowadays is I write code, I type into computers, I sit in front of screens, and in the end, if I'm happy with what I wrote, I make a commit, and what I create is a pull request. So something that looks like this. Well, the problem is that, as I guess most of you, I'm not working alone. So I work in a team, and when I have created this pull request, I need someone to do a code review, because otherwise I'm not able to merge my code, and it won't go in production, and no one will be able to use it. So, and I don't know if you share the same sentiment, but I think code reviews are hard. If I need the code review, I have to wait for someone else until they have time to do it. If they do it, they might have a lot of comments or questions, and it can take forever. Also, when I have to do the review for someone else, it's also annoying, because I have to read their code, I have to try to understand what it means. Most of the time, when I look into the pull request on GitHub, it's not in the right order, so I have to jump around and try to figure out what's happening. So code reviews are hard. And because that's a frequent problem, I think my team has, but other teams have as well, I was thinking, so maybe there's something we can learn from the publishing industry. Because they have been around for quite some time. I mean, depending on how you define it, the publishing industry, or publishing as a profession, has been around for a few hundred years. So they had a lot of time to refine their processes and figure out how to go from the book that the author writes to the book that you as the reader can hold in your hands. And on first glance, you might think they're not that similar. But I mean, if we go and start from the beginning, this is how I guess most people imagine an author to look like. Just a lonely person in front of their desk, writing in solitude, working alone. But the reality is maybe a bit different. And actually, this could also be a developer. If he had more screens, right, he could also be writing code. So, but what we don't see, or what we don't have in our heads as much, is that when we look at any book, and we open the first pages before the real book starts, we see something like this. So actually, the author is not the only person involved in making the book what it is as a final product. There are a lot of other people involved that shape how the thing is formed. So this is just one example, but there's a huge variety. So there are two professions that are there almost all the time. That's the editor and the copy editor. And then also people doing design, typesetting, and things like that, but I will skip those because we have our own designers as well, and we know what they do. So what happens if the manuscript from the author comes to the publishing house is that the manuscript is read a lot of times, and reviewed, and edited, and maybe the author himself has to change a few things. So it's similar to the process that happens when we write code. It's not just written and merged, it's written, reviewed, maybe changed, updated, and then merged. So let's have a look at the two most important jobs that go into making the book perfect. So the one job is the copy editor, and he has to look at the small details. He fixes, at first he fixes spelling errors and grammar. So actually that's very similar, right? Because natural languages have spelling rules and grammar rules, but programming languages have those as well. But on the other hand, I don't think that's something we really have to handle in code reviews, because we have the compiler most of the time that handles those issues for us. So I think on this aspect we're all good to go. We can hand that off to the computer. But there's also another aspect, and that's consistency. So in a lot of natural languages, they are not super strict on these rules. So for example, like in this case with the donut, there are two variant spellings that are both correct. And what happens is that a publishing house usually wants to use only one of these variants across all their books. So what they do is they decide on one set of rules or recommendations, and then they apply those to all their books to make sure that donut is spelled either the long or the short version in all of their books. A lot of times they don't have to come up with these rule set themselves. They can rely on, for example, dictionaries to provide some recommendations. So a German publishing house might decide that they always use the Duden recommendation for spelling. And then they never have to think about it, never have to discuss it, and they can even set this as a rule set in their spell checking tools. So this is a process that can be automated to a very large degree. And I think we know that we have very similar issues because most languages are not very strict as well on some aspects. For example, line breaks, tabs, spaces, how many spaces. And this is a search result on GitHub for fix indentation. So there are over 3 million commit results. I'm pretty sure there are also a lot of code review comments that go something like, please fix indentation. And I think this is really bad, because it's absolutely not necessary. This is such a trivial thing that can easily be done by computers. And I mean, even the publishing industry knows that we can automate these styling and consistency rules. So I think we should be able to do that as well. I think we should know more about computers. So what we do, we use tools. There are a lot of tools for all kinds of languages that help you do static code analysis. For example, the examples I have on the slides are for JavaScript, but they're available for all kinds of languages. So what you do is you use these tools, you decide in your team on a rule set you want to use, and then you never discuss it again. There should never be a second discussion about, do we use tabs or spaces? How far should we indent? And where should the opening bracket go? Discuss it once, and then hand it over to the machines. And if you really want to save time, you can just use an established set of rules, and you don't even have to discuss it once. So yeah. You can also set these tools up to automatically run on every save in your IDE. So you don't even have to think about it. You cannot forget it ever. So yeah, automate the trivial stuff away. Don't waste your time on it. And then, pro tip, you can set up a hook that runs these tools before every commit you make. So you cannot commit without having your linter running, without having all your indentation and spacing and everything fixed automatically. So it frees up so much of your time and the time of the reviewer if you hand that over to the computer. So, and then there's one other aspect that's often done by the copy editor. Sometimes it's a different person, but they do fact checking. And in our case, That's usually not that important, but it can be if the pull request is changing some aspect that involves domain knowledge. So this is the first part of the job of the copy editor that you should actually have to think about. Like if you see something that requires domain knowledge, you might want to make sure that it's used correctly. But apart from that, everything else that the copy editor does can, in our case, be totally automated away and handed over to the machines. So then let's go to the next person. That was the editor. I have a quote for you that is in the intro to Go in Action. And it's the author thanking their development editor, Jennifer Stout. And what this shows us is the importance the editor has on the final product. And also that the relationship between author and editor is actually a really positive one, because they are working together to create the final book. The editor's job is to polish it and to make it the best version that it can be. They also find mistakes. So they read the whole book, they look at the bigger picture, not at individual paragraphs, sentences, or words, but at the whole, and try to find if there are any plot holes or logical errors or anything. And just like that, it might happen that in a code review, you find a bug. It doesn't happen that often, but it has actually happened to me. And I think in most cases, those should be covered maybe by tests, but in some cases, those bugs that you find in the review are also based on some kind of domain knowledge that you need to have to find it. And in these cases where the person who wrote the code was missing or has wrong assumptions, the tests might also be wrong. So this is one part of your job as a reviewer, to see if the assumptions are correct or if there are any like nasty bugs in there. So then the main job is to look at the big picture and evaluate if the structure of the book is good, if it's well designed, if it flows well. And in our case, this would be like the whole architecture or structure. Are the files named reasonably? Is the folder structure useful? All these kinds of things. And this is like the main focus of what your job as a reviewer should be, because this is hard to automate, right? It's a lot of things that are based on opinion. And in this aspect, it's really, really important to keep in mind that your job as a reviewer is not to enforce your opinions. Your job is to always think of the reader, like the editor does. The editor's job is to advocate for the reader and try to make the book as good as possible for the reader that will get the book in the future. So in our case, who's the reader? It's not the user. The reader is, well, the whole team and every future teammate and yourself in the future. So what you always should have on top of your mind when you do the review is, can anyone in the future understand this code? So readability is the one thing that you should focus on. This can be naming of variables and functions. That can be breaking down into smaller functions, or also how the file is structured. Is it easy to find the most important part? Is it on top or on bottom of the file, or is it somewhere in between lots of, I don't know, styling and other unnecessary things? So, and naming, obviously. So focus on that. And then the other thing that should be your guiding principle is that you, as the reviewer, you should not try to make it your code. You shouldn't try to enforce your own preferences. Only recommend changes that are based on, readability or a very good reason. Don't try to insert your own preferences too much. And this is one aspect that's really important in the professional ethos of an editor. So what's important here? Writing good comments. So we saw earlier that the authors really liked their editor. And one aspect to make this happen is to make sure that you write your comments in a way that they will be accepted. So try to be friendly, try to be helpful. Because, I mean, when I was studying, I did a lot of copy editing for my friends when they were writing their thesis. And it feels really bad if you get it back and the whole page is red. So you have to make sure that you make you add some compliments in there as well. If you see 50 comments on your pull request, but some of them are like, hey, this was a really good catch, and hey, I liked what you did there, and nice that you cleaned this mess up here, even though it wasn't technically part of your task, then this really helps to create like a positive relationship. And the other thing is, what I always try to do is, when I write comments on a pull request, is to make very clear which ones are just some notes that I have, like compliments, or which ones are really the ones that I want to be read and changed. So make sure that it's always clear what is a change request and what is just a recommendation. So you can also ask questions. Because you should always keep in mind that the person who wrote the code has spent much more time than you did with this problem. So your assumption should always be that they know more than you, but it still can happen that they forget about some special case or something. But then don't assume that you know better, just ask if they might have considered this case or might have considered doing it another way. And if you have a change request, I always tend to make a suggestion of how to change it. For example, I think my most frequent change requests are naming problems, and then I always try to add a new recommendation for how they could change the variable name to be more readable. Yeah, so this is about comments. And then there's one other thing that I wanted to mention, and this is that in our case, one thing is really different to how it's working in publishing, and this is that we tend to switch roles. In publishing, you're either the author, or you're an editor, or a copy editor, or someone else. But in our case, it's actually way easier for us to empathize with the other side, because we are the other side most of the time. So we switch between one role and the other. And if you keep that in mind, you can also, it can help you to help your reviewer if you're the author. For example, make sure that you provide a very good explanation in the pull request about what's happening. You can also add comments yourself on the pull request to indicate some lines or some things that are really might look weird on first reading them. And what I always recommend, you can also offer the reviewer to go to the code together. So you can point out the flow of the logic much better than if you have it just in standard GitHub where everything is just ordered alphabetically, and it's not very helpful. So if you're the author, let go of your baby. Even if you created it, in the end, it's not yours. Just like an author, when he writes a book, he hands it over to the publishing house, and in the end it gets printed, and then it gets shipped off, and then it belongs to the reader. And just like that, you should always be aware that as soon as you have written the code and handed it off to the repo, it's not yours anymore. It belongs to the reader. So in our case, that's the whole team and future teammates, and you in the future. So let go. Don't be too attached to something you wrote, because you should always have one common goal, and that is to make it the best possible book that it can be, or the best possible code that it can be. So yeah, if you take one thing away, it is that I think most of what I told you can be implemented by one person alone, right? This whole part about the mindset, you can do that on your own. And the whole thing about the automation, I think your teammates will be really happy if you set that up for them. And they don't ever have to write comments in code reviews again about fixing indentation or spacings. So yeah, I hope this was helpful for you, and now you get to enjoy the lunch break. Thank you very much.